understanding the issue of actually help individual citizens.
Policy questions that the government might have about these kind of long-term changes in operations.
And actually, when I talk about leadership, this is
My name is Chiyapat Rashatan, and we are pleased to welcome you this morning on behalf of the Health Intervention and Technology Assessment Program. We are excited to have you here with us for this session, which is being organized by HITAP, the National University of Singapore, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and the Lancet as part of a forthcoming commission on epidemiological modeling with the support of the Prince Mahidol Award Conference.
We are very pleased to have a live audience here, as well as those who are joining us online. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We also, right. Thank you. We are recording this session so that we have this for future reference. So do please take note of that. So to get us started this morning, we'd like to do a short exercise on Menti. Please go on to menti.com for those of you who have access to internet. You can go directly on the site and plug in these numbers, which is a code 32721703. Alternatively, you can just scan the QR code and go directly to the page. Once you get there, please hit the cat or heart buttons to just show us that you're there and that we are beating and alive and ready to go. So just a few seconds to have everyone on. If anyone needs any help getting on, do just raise your hand, and one of our team will come and assist you. Okay. Great to see a lot of people on, some liking cats and some the heart. But okay, I think we have a bit of a quorum.
Yeah.
Great. So shall we move to the next question, to the first question rather? And just to get warmed up, let's see how everyone is doing. For those of you who are feeling splendid, please do hit that button. Those who are excited to be here this morning, please do also hit that button. And lastly, those who are really ready and raring to go for what PMAC 2023 has to offer. Great to see that we are all on a starting this day on a very positive note and really raring to go. So with that, out of the way, I'll hand it back to Chayapat to take us to the next question.
Right. So let's go to the next question. So we would like to ask you to name a crisis, whether it's health or other, that has left a huge impact in your life.
Should it be about COVID or something else?
Yeah, it can be something else.
Okay.
Maybe, yeah, COVID-19.
Okay, car accident. Yes, road traffic injuries is a major issue here in Thailand too. So that's actually an important area. War, finance.
Cancer.
Aging, yes, very relevant for our region in particular.
Yeah. Climate change.
Climate change, yes, the theme for this conference.
Yes, so I think most of us are answering COVID-19 as expected. So maybe we next to the last question for today. Yeah, so do you think modeling can help address some of the issues arising from crisis? Whether it's yes or no?
That's reassuring. Most people here do believe in the power of modeling. That makes it easier for our panelists today. But there are some who still have concerns, so hopefully we can answer those along the way.
Right.
So Chayapat, should we move on to see what's in store for this session?
Sure. But before that, maybe we just would like to ask you to save the link of the Menti. In order you have any question, you can type the questions anytime. And then during the panel discussion, we will pick up some of the questions from the audiences and then answering that during that time. Okay. So next, we would like to share our objectives of today's talk. which our speakers here today will share the stories about crisis from different fields and to share about common trends. Then we also plan to discuss the role of the modeling in this nexus.
And to achieve or go towards those to reach those objectives, we have a scintillating agenda, starting with opening remarks by our chair this morning, followed by 3 speakers who will share their stories in the format of a PMAC talk, as we like to call it, inspired by TED Talks, and to share their stories in a way in 10 short minutes, after which we'll also have a video presentation by a colleague from WHO who's not able to join us here, which will all form the basis for, we hope, a rich discussion, which will be moderated by our chair this morning. We'll close the session with a short introduction to the Lancet Commission on Epidemiological Modeling, as Chayapat mentioned before. So, without further ado, please allow us to now introduce the chair for this session, Professor Y.Y. Teo, who is the Dean of the School of Public Health at the National University of Singapore. He's an eminent expert in this field and has also led many research initiatives in the region. So please join us in warmly welcoming Professor Y.Y.
Right, good morning, everyone. So thank you for joining us this morning. I know there have been a series of very high-quality site meetings that you could have gone to, but you chose this one. So hopefully we won't disappoint. And I thought it's very useful to start off by really highlighting that as part of the PMAC, we've always been looking at what are the mega trends in the world that have been affecting global public health. And some of the mega trends have already happened in our lives. For example, looking at globalization, movement of people across countries, not just across countries, but even urbanizations and the creation of mega cities where people are moving from rural parts of the world to more urban cities. This has led to the issue of demographic changes, where aging is a problem that is facing many countries, not just developed economies, but also low and middle income countries as well. Technology has clearly made a big difference in our lives. For any of you who have not yet heard about ChatGPT, strongly encourage you to just Google it after this exciting session. And then right now, we face a big mega trend around geopolitics. And I believe geopolitics will be the theme of next year's PMAC as well. So with this mega trends really comes the increasing likelihood of a number of health crises. Of course, we have already seen and experienced our own health crisis in the form of COVID-19 that has pretty much plagued our lives for the past 3 years. But it's not just pandemics that have been one of the crises that the world is faced with. All along, we have problems like antimicrobial resistance, we have the rising prevalence of non-communicable diseases. This have all been affecting the lives of not just individuals, but entire communities and populations. And I'm not even talking about the rising prevalence of mental health issues around the world. Now, when we start to look at some of these mega trends affecting the likelihood of the rise of crisis, which is really what this site meetings is about, looking at the future, current and future crisis, and really what are the solutions that we can bring to bear to tackle some of this crisis that we have. And that's where modeling has interestingly emerged as one of the technical skill set that has helped to advance a lot of the policy decisions and even communications to the public in terms of how do we look at the COVID-19 wave that is happening in different parts of the world right now. Governments, policymakers have been advised by modelers such as Professor Gabriel Leong, such as Professor Alex Cook, on how to make use of data to change their perception of COVID-19. But it's really not just in pandemic preparedness, because when I start to look at why is modeling important or even powerful, I can think of 4 possible reasons. The first, it's really as a key driver of action. When I talk about key driver of action, that's where you look at modeling and you start to realize that modeling tells you what is the likely impact of climate change, of the loss in biodiversity, of antimicrobial resistance to the health of individuals and to the health of population. That helps you that tells the government what is likely to happen if they refuse to act. And it's not just looking at health burden. Economic modeling is also a key driver of action because economic modeling tells you what is the cost of inaction and also the cost of action, because that's where you start to think about trade-offs, balancing trade-offs, which I will talk about in a bit. And when we start to think about government expenditure, and this is where I encourage you to think back to COVID-19, you realize that government need to spend. And how do we justify financing and the outcomes that is generated from the expenditure? This is again where modeling comes in to be very powerful as a driver of action. The second, of course, modeling tells you whether things are truly working and effective. That's where the classical narrative around monitoring and evaluation in global health comes in, because modeling tells you around what works, what didn't, and also whether it is working at the cost per dollar value that you're getting, the cost effectiveness of it. The third is what I mentioned earlier on, really around modeling helps us to set trade-offs, to discuss priorities, and to find out trade-offs. And I will use the theme of PMAC this year, because this year is really around sustainability, climate action, biodiversity changes, and how all of this impact health. Now, if I ask all of you this question around the reduction in the use of plastics, plastic waste, or plastic bags, and do we even understand how much do we save in carbon credits if we reduce our personal use of plastic bags versus just not taking the car one day a week and taking public transportation? What is that trade-off? And I've done some background reading to try and find out what this trade-off is. And perhaps my search ability is not that great, but I couldn't actually find a very compelling reason to say that if I stop driving one day a week and take public transportation instead, actually it is equivalent to 400 plastic bags of carbon credits. Understanding this trade-off actually helped individual citizens like you and me make real life decisions around what we should be doing on a daily basis. This is where modeling comes in to tell you what the trade-offs would be. And finally, modeling is a very powerful tool to help with resource allocation. And we have seen again that with COVID-19, there was this massive, not just national scramble around identifying the health resources that's needed, but it was an international scramble. In Singapore, we were scrambling in the first few months over face masks. But do we truly need that amount of face masks? Do we truly need that amount of vaccine supply? Or are countries now faced with a different problem of expired vaccines that they have to throw away? So identifying what are the optimal level of health resourcing, whether it is manpower resourcing or whether it is consumable pharmaceutical resourcing, those sits at the heart of what modeling can help. So with that, I hope I have given a very simple introduction to what modeling can do in the face of a crisis, and I hope my fellow panelists will illustrate what I've said with real-life examples very much involved in what they have been involved in for the past few years of their lives. So with that, thank you very much again, and I shall hand it over to our co-host. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Waitio, for setting at the stage. So next, we would like to welcome Professor Gabriel Leung. He's from University of Hong Kong and also the Executive Director of Hong Kong Jockey Club. He also has experience in policy-making capacity in Hong Kong. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Professor Gabriel Leung.
so much. May I have my slides, please? First of all, thank you to the organizers for bringing me here, and Saren has done so much to make life easy. And of course, it's great to be on the same panel with colleagues from really a long time that we've worked together. So I was given the task of telling stories for 10 minutes. So perhaps this is storytelling time in the first session of these side meetings just before PMAC proper starts later on this week. We have the next slide. This paper really has now been cited about 20,000 times. And of course, it's sad that it has been cited so frequently. This is actually one of the defining papers of the first 400 cases, 425 to be precise, from Wuhan in China. In fact, I finished this paper sitting in my hotel coffee shop on the sidelines of the PMAC meeting in 2020. And the reason that I show you this is to say, look, we really need to be able to respond with a huge breadth of tools at our disposal, and then really sort of zero in and try to be adaptive and flexible. PMAC that year, in 2020, if you remember, was on UHC. That was the topic of the global health agenda. Infectious diseases was the last thing on anybody's mind. But by that time, and PMAC started proper, PMAC started January 28th in 2020, there were already officially, I think 70 cases. And then what we had been doing from New Year's Eve of 2019, which was the first notification, until this time, which is barely 3 weeks, just before PMAC, I had already been to Beijing to work on this particular outbreak. And of course, I was finishing the paper when I was in Bangkok. And in fact, this is the only paper that I've ever done where the editor and the deputy editor were the peer reviewers and the copy editors at the same time. I have never had a paper that was accepted within 48 hours of submission, and the copy editor was actually the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal. But scientifically, the interesting thing about this particular paper is, this is, of course, the classical epicurve. The lighter colors were the cases that were not linked to the Huanan seafood market. So just from looking at the color shading here, you see, in fact, the first 1, 2 cases were not linked to the seafood market. The third was, 4th, 5th, 6th were not. So you could already see that, well, yes, the amplification center might have been there, but certainly in terms of really, was that ground zero, it's still, or it was already a very open question. The other thing that I used to teach, and I actually went to London, seeing that this is a London School co-sponsored event, I went to give this talk just after this came out. I was in London mid-February in 2020, and Peter Piot asked me to give a talk at the London School because it was sort of hot off the press. So I said to the students, never believe an epicurve in an emerging, still ongoing epidemic. Because if you actually just casually look at this epicurve, the whole thing is over. But for an ongoing outbreak, that's simply because of time lag. The epicurve of a growing outbreak will inevitably look like this. And that's a major pitfall if you actually believe, just casually glancing at the shape, then you get it wrong. Because obviously it went on to grow and grow and grow. Next slide. So the next slide is actually from the same paper. And these were the key intervals that you would try and estimate in modeling, because these intervals allow you to make certain assumptions, and then you can try to project and try to do nowcasting and forecasting. Without these key intervals, you couldn't do anything. You'd just be guessing. And before these key intervals became available, if you wanted a prior, you would have no choice but to go back to look at the other coronaviruses and assume that they have similar epidemiological characteristics, which is what actually some of the very, very earliest models actually did. But having said all that, two things. One, this is a classical incubation period. This has not just public health implications, but clinical implications, of course. This is a serial interval, which is not the same as generation time, but close enough. But it's very fragile. It's actually based on six pairs of case contacts. That was it. The whole world relied on this 6 clusters of case contacts. Actually, it's 6 pairs, but 5 clusters. The whole world relied on this for about 2 months. Very, very fragile. So be careful, be careful. It's good that it turned out to be correct, but it could have been very wrong. Next slide. Now, this is a paper that Jocelyn Clark edited as executive editor of The Lancet back in the day. She was just emailing me last night and said, hey, I remember 3 years ago, almost to the day, I was editing your paper. Well, this was the paper that she was editing. And this paper basically said, look, we have absolutely no idea how big it might grow. And an earlier version of this paper was actually submitted to The Lancet, which they very wisely turned down until we got more data. And once we have more data, then they very sensibly took it and then published it, because this was the first. It actually went live on the 28th or 29th of January, telling the world that this is going to grow very, 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 very big. And these were the projected epi curves using some sort of assumptions about the force of infection, and in terms of whether the zoonosis was mostly responsible for the early clusters, or actually it had gone human to human from the very, very beginning, from the get-go. And then very specifically for major cities across China, giving some predictions of how many cases there had already been. So this was a nowcasting paper to say, obviously, testing, reporting were imperfect, as they would be anywhere at the very, very beginning of a completely novel pathogen, but this was most likely what had already happened. And Thailand actually played a key role in allowing us to do this paper. There were 2 things. One is very, very good pickups at the borders. So there was no way of estimating how big the Wuhan cluster really was until Japan and Thailand actually picked up imported cases. Once that happened, and you can get airline passenger volume data, then you can make certain assumptions, and then you can say, well, if it manages to throw out these X number of exported cases to these places, and given the air traffic volume, then the original cluster size must be at least that big. And then using that, then we use big data for train Spring Festival-related travel, which is the largest human migration that is ongoing, by the way. And we then said, well, this is what could happen unless something major is done, which, of course, China did on the 23rd of January 2020. It essentially locked the entire country down, and within provinces and within cities, within any particular province. So Thailand really played a very, very key role. I remember being on the phone with Dr. Suet, who is my most reliable Thai public health guru. And in times like these, it's very, very useful because there were only 2 people that I picked up the phone to. 3. I needed data from Thailand. I needed data from Japan because these were the 2 places that picked up the Wuhan cases. So I rang Dr. Keizo Takimi for Japan, and I rang Dr. Suet in Thailand. And they were very, very forthcoming in sharing the data because this is a very serious global health issue. And the third person I called was my contact in Tencent, which is the WeChat app. So they had all the data of the train travel patterns. And so with those 3 key sources of data, this actually came out, and we turned out to have been correct. Unfortunately for the world, but fortunately for the research team. Next slide. Then I remember Sumia, the chief scientist of the WHO, co-convened with Jeremy Farrar, who is now the designate chief scientist of the WHO, but still the director of the Wellcome Trust, co-convened a R&D meeting at WHO in Geneva. That was probably February 2020. I remember it very distinctly because I was asked to go to this meeting in Geneva. I flew from Hong Kong to Geneva after Thailand. And then the morning that I got in, I finished the morning session. I chaired the epi session, and I finished it. And then I got a call from Maria van Kerkel, who's still the COVID lead for the WHO. And Maria said, "Oh, where are you?" I said, "I'm in Geneva. Where are you?" She said she was in Beijing. And she said, "Well, please get on the next flight. We need you in Beijing." So this was the reason, because there was a joint mission. This is not the famous or infamous joint mission on Origins. This is not. This actually predated the Origins mission by a lot. This took place in February 2020. So there were 13 people, 6 from the Chinese side, 6 from the WHO side, and I was the odd one out because I was supposed to be nominated by both sides. So we then had this joint mission, and these 13 people went to 4 provinces, obviously Wuhan, Guangzhou, Beijing, and Shenzhen. We went to these places, and we looked around, and we produced the first report, which was, again, largely confirming the epidemiological picture and the public health implications of COVID. And that report came out in the ensuing 2-3 weeks, and that really sort of set the scene for the declaration of the public health emergency of international concern, the FAIC, that was declared. This is not the first joint mission that I sat on. Unfortunately, the last one I sat on was also a human catastrophe in West Africa. That was in 2015, but those were mostly the sort of review reports. You'll remember that there was a WHO one, there was a UN one, there was a London School, Harvard joint one, and then there was a 4th one convened or led by the National Academy of Medicine in the US. So this came out February 28th, officially. And next slide. One of the side benefits of teaching is that you have students all over the place. And when you are on these joint missions, you travel, and then the people who receive you were once upon a time your students. So when I was in Guangzhou, which is in the southern province of Guangdong, just north of Hong Kong in China, I ran into my students who actually came to see us to give testimony right straight out from the ICU. They were caring for COVID patients. And then they said to me, "Hey, there is something kind of weird going on. We've got this huge data set. Would you please help us make some sense of it?" Well, this is the huge data set. And basically, they were all case contact pairs, very, very detailed line list information. And this is the chief of the ICU in one particular hospital, who was once upon a time my student. And he's a clinician, so he has no idea what to do with it. So I took it, and then I looked at it, and I said, well, you know what this shows? This actually shows pre-symptomatic transmission, i.e., about day -3 before symptoms appear, COVID would start to spread. And this is the original Wuhan strain. Of course, Omicron is even worse. And that's why it is so difficult to control. And if you sort of go back 20 years exactly to this day with SARS, SARS was much more easily controlled because peak infectivity was when fever spiked at the highest, and that was about day 5 to 7 after first symptoms. So long as you lock up all of the fever patients, then you're laughing. But this thing spreads day -3. And that's really from, I mean, it boils down to it, this was actually the most important diagram. Next, and I believe it is my penultimate slide. Left panel, right panel, key figure is this one, key figure is that one. They appear in 2 different publications, this one in Nature Medicine, this one in Lancet ID, both very, very good journals, from 2 different teams using 2 different modeling approaches. This was a team led by the Imperial Group, Neil Ferguson, who I knew when we were both very junior during SARS, and we worked together during that time. This was my team. Trying to figure out what is the case fatality risk. So how deadly is this thing? When you get the exact same results using 2 different data sets, 2 different modeling approaches, the Imperial team and actually us working together with Mark Lipsich's team at Harvard, I reached out to Mark Lipsich and I said, Mark, we needed to get this out within a week. We probably are so tired by that point that we probably might have made some mistakes in the code. And I said, I need you to completely replicate it. He very, very readily obliged. And therefore, you've got 3 teams on 3 different continents getting the same results. We're pretty sure. Final slide. Oh, this story is wonderful. Since 2009, the last flu pandemic, we started to have these experiments with Don Milton. You may remember him. He moved from Harvard to Maryland. He's still at Maryland. And he does these Gesundheit machines, G2 machines, which basically gets infected patients to breathe into a big machine and collect viral particles. We showed, using that setup, that for coronaviruses, not for COVID, okay, it's just the 4 human coronaviruses, that a mask absolutely stops it. And that is why you see me putting on a mask, because I'm still a COVID virgin. With that, I thank you, and I hope I've told a good story for you to discuss and to seed your questions and answers. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Professor Gabriel, for that very much first-hand experience from the early days of COVID, and which still resonates and has an impact on our lives. You've highlighted so many key points, including how important networks are, especially in such times when there's uncertainty, and then also the value and responsibility for publishing such data and such work, especially in the early days. So thank you. We'll be talking a lot more about this, I think, later in the discussion. With that, we'll perhaps move to our next speaker today, Associate Professor Dr. Alex Cook. He is the Vice Dean for Research at the NUS School of Public Health as well, and his work has contributed, he's an infectious disease modeler, and his work has contributed to policy in Singapore as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alex Cook.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? I'm not sure about the mic. Is it on? Okay, fabulous. So thank you for the invitation to come. I'm slightly less grateful that you put me immediately after Gabriel's, one of the leading voices in the field of ID epidemiology. I'll try my best, but I won't be quite as good a speaker as him. Because we do have one of the world's leading ID epidemiologists here, I thought that rather than talking about the ID modeling work that I've been doing over the last few years, instead I would talk about some of the non-communicable disease modeling that we've been doing in the School of Public Health at the National University of Singapore. So I'm going to give you 2 examples, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned along the way in academic government partnerships. So the first example I want to talk about is from about 10 years ago. So it seems like it was just yesterday, but no, a decade ago, when my team was working on developing a simulation model that would allow us to upscale the kind of micro-level data that you get from epidemiological studies, cohort studies, case control studies, and so on. To upscale that to a population level that we'd then be able to take data that we're previously observing just at individuals, and then see what would be the effect of changes to risk factors over long periods of time at the entire population. The intent of this was that we'd be able to answer policy questions that the government might have about these kind of long-term changes in the health of the population. We chose to use diabetes as our first case study for a few reasons. One, Singapore's a predominantly Asian population. Asians have got a higher risk of developing diabetes for everything else equal. In Singapore, we've actually had historically quite low diagnosis rates for diabetes. About half of people who have diabetes 10 years ago knew that they had diabetes, or half of them didn't know that they had it. And also because we had seen over the past decades that there's been a rise in risk factors, a rise in sedentary lifestyles, a more Western diet, which tends to put on the pounds a little bit more, and therefore we've been seeing a rise in overweight and obesity in the country. So we used modeling to pull together information from these different sources, from our own school's cohort studies to information from the government, from their cross-sectional surveys that they've conducted, from the literature, so we know about what's the relationship between the risk factors and outcomes. And we put these all together within the modeling framework, and that allows us then to look at what are the emergent properties of the system. It's a little bit like when in ID modeling you start with R0 and you see what the overall epidemic will look like. You go from individuals to the population. So after developing this big model, we then gave the results of it out to our economist colleagues. They tried to work out what the economic impact of diabetes would be. And then we wrote up a little paper about it. It's not one of these Lancet papers or New England papers that Gabriel has. Much more modest journal article. And for me, that was the end of it. I thought, okay, I've done my research. I've published my little paper. I can now go on to another disease. However, our former dean, before YY became the dean, insisted that, no, that shouldn't be the end. I should go and speak to the media, the local media in Singapore about this, because we thought that the prevalence I was estimating for 2050, 15, 16%, he thought that was quite a big number, and we should use that and try to generate some interest. So I'm a very obedient person. Like I didn't follow instructions, or I did follow instructions. Don't have any slides. So I went to speak to the media, and the journalist that I spoke to was like, "Hey, it's very boring what you've said. You've got 15%, 16%. Who cares about these percentages? But 2050, Singapore should have a population of 6 million. So 16% of 6 million is 1 million. Hey, and that's quite an exciting number. So next page is the newspaper's got like 1 million diabetics in Singapore by 2050. And my health economist colleagues had suggested there'd be $1 billion of economic impact by the same time point. And so this kind of combination of an interpretable health outcome and an interpretable and large economic outcome kind of generated quite a bit of, I guess, trepidation by moving it from abstract to something more concrete. Trepidation in the population as well as in the government. This trepidation built up over the next 1 or 2 years until eventually the Minister of Health in Parliament declared war on diabetes. So my little paper got cited in Parliament, which I thought was quite nice. So by declaring war on diabetes, essentially the Singapore government took a whole-of-government approach. So it wasn't just the Ministry of Health that was declaring war, but rather the government of Singapore. You had different ministries all getting involved with trying to tackle some of the causes. So for example, by making fitness more available for Singaporeans by subsidizing their memberships of gyms and so on. So the first of the take-home messages I want to talk about then is really about communication, the importance of communication of our modeling results. If we are just treating it as a percentage in a little scientific article, that's not going to get the kind of traction that we need. Rather, we need to translate it away from something that is abstract to something that's much more concrete and can be interpreted by the general population, but also by the policymakers, because in the government, you've got a lot of technically excellent people, but the people at the very top are smart but not technical experts. And so we need to make sure that we're speaking about things in a way that will be understood easily by them. I think a second point along that same theme is that it showed the importance of maintaining ties with our government. I realize I say ties, I'm immediately thinking Thailand. So we need to make sure that we actually are continuing to communicate on a regular basis with the governments. We now have a series of regular meetings with the Ministry of Health in Singapore. I'm in the MOH building about once a month on average, just to have a meeting about this or about that. And that's really helped to kind of socialize the work that we do within the School of Public Health with the needs of government. And so that leads on to my second example. So a few years before COVID, which is now 5 years ago, gosh, I got a call from one of the people in MOH that I met regularly over the course of the last decade to say that he was quite worried, the government was worried, about a new concerted campaign by a large tobacco manufacturer to push for e-cigarettes to be legalized. So I'll give you a little bit of context on that. So Singapore has, at the point, had not legalized e-cigarettes. Tends to take a very cautious wait-and-see approach and see how it goes in other countries, and then if it looks like it's okay, then we'll follow suit. Now, the proponents of e-cigarettes were arguing that because they're less damaging than regular cigarettes, if we could get current smokers and switch them so that they'll now be vapors instead, then overall we may have less harm. However, opponents of e-cigarettes say, well, contrary-wise, they're more dangerous than not smoking at all, and therefore, if you legalize e-cigarettes, yeah, you may convert some smokers to vapors, but you'll also have non-smokers becoming vapors. And it's not entirely clear which of these will do the most harm at a population level. So after speaking with my buddy in MOH, I said, well, do you want us to model it? And he was like, yeah, could you? So I said, okay, we'll go ahead, we'll do a model of this. We built a model, a lot of uncertainty in the model. It's like in the early days of COVID, there's a lot of things that we didn't know, because at the time e-cigarettes were not legal in Singapore. So we had to look to other countries and try to extrapolate from there to see what we think the effect will be in our country. The main findings from the study was that we think that, yeah, there probably would be some short-term benefits from legalizing e-cigarettes, because you get a large number of people who are not able to stop smoking but may switch to vaping. But that in the long run, over most of the scenarios that we looked at, we'd see that there'd be more harm overall, and therefore we showed this to the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Law, and after this, they decided to keep the ban, and therefore, to this date, Singapore just still does not allow vaping. Now, I want to just stress that it is not that we determine policy. It's not like MOH was sitting there waiting, twiddling their thumbs for us to come along with a modeling result, and it's okay now. You said it's no good, so we won't allow it. But rather, I am sure that we contributed to the decision-making process, perhaps by giving them a way to justify a decision that they already wanted to make, but now need to have like some objective scientists supporting that. So what facilitated these success stories? I think there's 3 points that I'd like to just stress. One is the communication I mentioned, so the quite deep and frequent communication we have with our partners in the ministry. The second is the wherewithal, the financial wherewithal to be able to do this. Most of our school's funding comes from the Ministry of Health. Therefore, we're slightly obliged to help them out when they come along with a problem. Otherwise, next funding review, we won't get so much money. But importantly, some of that funding is not tied to specific projects. In other words, when a policy question emerges, and usually the answer needs to be within days, if not weeks, we're able to quite quickly redeploy some of our existing resources to tackle that problem. That would not be as easily done if everything is locked up to a specific branch and you've got to wait a year before you get the results and start work on it. I think that the third and final point I want to stress is that we've also ensured alignment with academic rewards and this kind of activity. So in many other departments in the university, if you're doing work which is not leading to a paper, then that's a big no-no. You will not get tenure, etc. You won't get full professor. Within the School of Public Health, we value that kind of applied translational work, and therefore, hopefully, I will get my full professor promotion at some point as a result of some of this work that we've done with the government. So I hope in the last few seconds that I've given you a bit of a sense of how modeling can contribute, not just to the acute crises that Gabriel spoke about, but also to these kind of long-term chronic crises that would be akin to the climate crisis. I think that within Singapore, we do have this very useful partnership between government and academia, and partly that is just because Singapore is so small. It's literally just a 15-minute cab journey from us to them. and there's only the one school of public health, so they don't have a lot of our people they can go to. But nevertheless, I hope that Singapore does form a kind of a useful case study for some bigger countries to think about when they look at academic-government partnerships. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Alex Cook, for such an interesting talk. So next, we would like to invite Dr. Modi Masama. She is the head of capacity and field development for climate and health at the Wellcome Trust. So please give a round of applause to Dr. Modi.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak today. So I'm going to give a short overview talk with covering three areas. I'll briefly introduce you to the climate change agenda globally, talk about why it is Wellcome has decided to prioritize tackling climate change and health as one of its strategic priorities, and then just end with how we're planning to tackle this problem. So I don't have a modelling background, but you'll see in my talk that modelling does feature in helping to solve climate change. Next slide. So just very briefly, for those who don't know, Wellcome, I think most people here will be familiar, but we're a major philanthropic foundation which in 2021 embarked on a new strategy which aims to solve three of the world's global challenges: climate change, infectious diseases, and mental health. We also fund discovery research, which we've done ever since our existence over the last 50 years or so. And over the next 10 years, we're planning to invest £16 billion in solving our new strategy. On to the next slide, please. So the Paris Agreement was a landmark global framework that was adopted by governments who committed to collaborate together in order to solve the world's climate crisis. It was adopted following 13 years of negotiations under the auspices of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it was a landmark because for the first time, governments had made commitments to actually act on climate change as opposed to just talk about it. The governments who signed up to this have committed to do three things. The first is to commit to reducing emissions to align with limiting global warming to below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees. The second is committing to introduce measures to adapt to climate change. And then the third is to mobilize sustainable financing in order to tackle the climate change crisis. On to the next slide. Unfortunately, this slide highlights the take-home message is that progress towards achieving the climate goals is far from where it needs to be if we're to halt global warming towards 1.5 degrees or below 2 degrees as a minimum. So on the left-hand side, you've got existing policies in action, which is the current trajectory. We're on track to, by the end of the century, global warming will have increased by 2.7 degrees. And even under the most optimistic scenario, on this side, on the right-hand side here, if governments were to implement all their existing policies, both long-term and short-term pledges that they've made, plus implement any policies that are currently under discussion to tackle climate change, if all of the above were to be done, we would still fail to meet the Paris goals that the governments have signed up to. So progress is woefully below where it should be. We're currently at 1.5. We're currently around here, around 1 degree warming above pre-industrial levels, and we're already starting to see the impacts of that through increased things like floods, fires, major disasters happening around the world. So we're already suffering. On current trends, between 2030 and 2050, there'll be an extra 250,000 deaths a year as a result of climate change-induced changes to nutrition, malaria, heat, and other infectious diseases. So climate change is already having an impact at the current levels of warming. If we don't carry on the trajectory we're going to be on, things are going to get even worse. There are also health benefits from acting on climate change. So, for instance, a study by Ian Hamilton and colleagues published in the Lancet Countdown looked at what the impacts would be across 9 countries of tackling 3 of the biggest sectors that contribute to greenhouse emissions. Those are food systems, energy, and transport. And what they found across these 9 countries, which represent half of the world's population, 70% of emissions from these sectors, would be that each year 1 million deaths would be prevented from air pollution, 6 million deaths would be prevented from improvements in diets, and a further 1 million deaths would be prevented from improvements in physical activity. So there's significant co-benefits to be had from addressing climate change on the health side. And those health benefits can also result in cost savings to healthcare systems, increase productivity in the economy, which would help to offset the costs for actually tackling climate change. And that's one of the reasons why we as Wellcome have decided to prioritize this as an issue. Our peers who work in climate philanthropy, also those working in governments and the advocates, have argued that we need a significant injection in action, and health can be a big motivator for governments to act, because both people care about it individually, but then also politically it's easier to sell some of the really significant changes that are needed if there's a health co-benefit to them. And so then on to the next slide. Another way of looking at the climate change, current status of climate change today, is looking at what are the most influential scientific papers that are currently out there in the media. This is an analysis that was done by the Carbon Brief, and what they did is they looked at what the most influential science papers were in climate science published last year. You don't necessarily need to look at the detail, but essentially the top 10 global impactful science papers, which were impactful as measured by the fact that they were most reported in the media, on Twitter, in blogs, also cited in science papers, they were all focused on impacts of climate change. The good news for health is that 3 of those papers with the stars looked at climate impacts on health. So looking at things like what's the impact on climate on infectious diseases, what's the impact of, one of them was what's the impact of climate if you switch from coal to clean energy, for example. What this also tells us is that unfortunately there's not that many scientific papers on the solutions for climate change. What are the solutions to help people mitigate climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change in ways that protect health, for example. So that's a big gap area in the literature. The other thing around the most influential scientific journals is a question of diversity. So 9 out of 10 authors in the top 25 science journals were affiliated with Global North institutions. Less than a third of the authors contributing to these papers were women. So there's a big diversity problem also linked to the global science problem. And this is not just reflected in these most influential papers that were published in Nature Science and The Lancet. It is also replicated throughout the literature. So for instance, a review by Leah Beringford and colleagues used machine learning to assess all the scientific papers out there on science. They identified around 16,000 papers, and just 10% of those papers were focused on mitigation solutions, 7% were focused on adaptation solutions, similar levels of lack of diversity in the authorship. So that's another area where we're thinking about how can we as Wellcome help to increase that diversity, identify solutions that context-specific and relevant in different parts of the world, and also increase the diversity of the influential scientists contributing to the climate debate at the global level. So that finally takes me on to the how of our strategy. And I will end on this basically slide, which summarizes our mission in climate change, which is really to put health at the heart of climate action. And we're going to be doing that to address it through addressing 4 main goals. The first is really about generating evidence to understand comprehensively what are the impacts of climate change on health now and into the future. So looking at the impacts on things like how air quality, outcomes related to food and insecurity, disease-related outcomes, malaria, dengue, waterborne diseases, extreme heat and weather events, and also socially mediated impacts through things like migration, for instance. So really quantifying those to help people really be aware of what's coming on the horizon if we fail to act in the way we're currently failing to act. The second goal is really looking at what are the effective solutions which we can promote to help governments mitigate against climate change in ways that maximize health benefits. So looking at those global figures, but then also what are the individual solutions that are best for different countries in different contexts. The third is about understanding what are the effective interventions which can help governments adapt to climate change and in ways that also protect health. And then we have a fourth goal around field building, which is the area I lead, which is really about building a global community, first of all, researchers who are able to research and understand the climate change problem, facilitate better collaborations between those working in the health sector, climate change, and other relevant sectors that are needed to tackle climate change. But then also supporting policymakers, practitioners, the general public, to be able to understand the evidence that's produced and then use it to put health at the heart of climate action. Our strategy is going to be both top-down and bottom-up. So the bottom-up approach is really going to be about looking at investing in target countries or regions where the needs are greatest to support both the researchers to generate research and evidence on the solutions, but then also support the policymakers and the advocates to be able to use that evidence in order to drive change in those target countries or regions, which are still to be determined. And then the top-down approach will be us using our whole-of-welcome approach, both our research funding that I sit in, as well as our government relations, policy, communications, public engagement teams, to really drive the process of putting health at the heart of climate agenda at the global level, so influencing the top scientists who are contributing to the IPCC that feeds into the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, for example, helping to raise the voices of different stakeholders in these global debates on climate change to really help drive that transformative change that's needed. Modelling will definitely be a part of it, and I'm happy to talk about some of the examples of things we might be doing in the future. But at this stage, we're here at PMAC to meet people here from different parts of the world, hear about the different needs across research, policy and practice, and really help identify what we can do together to solve climate change. So I'm looking forward to meeting you over the next few days and collaborating together in future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Modi, for giving us that big picture view on climate change and how it really encompasses all the discussions we are having and going to have over the next few days as well. You highlighted, I think, a very important and promising new area as well about climate and health. And I think we are really excited about how this discussion also, how this field grows, as well as welcome strategy. And that really helps set the stage for our next intervention from our colleague from the WHO, Dr. Joseph Spadaro. He's a senior environmental research scientist who works with WHO Europe, and he has created a tool that can help quantify the benefits or the effects on health of emission reductions on health and the economy. So without further ado, I'd just like to request our colleagues to turn on the video.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joseph Spadaro, and I'm an environmental research scientist. Many thanks go to the organizers of this event for their kind invitation to discuss my ongoing work for WHO on the nexus between climate change policy and health co-benefits. In particular, I will be presenting the Climate Mitigation, Air Quality and Health Climate Gauge software. My presentation consists of two parts, an intro to the Climate Gauge tool, followed by two demonstration case studies. An introduction to Climate Gauge. What is Climate Gauge? Climate Gauge is a decision support tool that allows users to differentiate among options considered in national action plans, the so-called nationally determined contributions, NDC for short, that aim to tackle climate change by considering the health and economical benefits achieved at the national level, as well as to identify any regional spillover benefits. The target year is 2030, the first reporting year of the NDC process. Climate Gauge is also a didactic tool to help build up local capacity and promote data collection. In developing Climate Gauge, the emphasis has been to reduce the number of inputs to include only the key data required to run a simple analysis. such as emission reductions of particulate matter and gaseous species. Advanced users can enter more information. Most of the requirements of the impact analysis are included directly in the software as default data, which can be manipulated by the user. Carbon H is available for the WHO European region, but work is ongoing to develop versions in other areas such as North and South America. The main steps in the impact analysis consist of specification of the emission reductions, indicated here by the yellow box. Next, calculation of the change in ambient concentrations, a process usually modeled endogenously, but the user may enter the information directly into the tool if it is externally available, shown by the blue box. Then, estimation of the population weighted exposure by combining demographic and concentration data, shown by the gray box. Next, quantification of the health benefits calculated by mathematical expressions known as concentration response functions that combine baseline incidence data on morbidity and mortality with population exposures, indicated by the red box. And finally, quantification of the associated monetary benefit, indicated by the green box. Output results may feed into other types of decision analysis, including benefit cost analysis of the climate policy being evaluated, or may act as a catalyst to spur more ambitious NDC targets. ClimateGauge generates 3 output products capturing the benefits both at the national level, the country in which emission reductions occur, and at the regional scale, transboundary effects. These are 1. The PM 2.5 concentration change, 2. A synthesis of the health gains, including postponed premature deaths and cumulative gains in life expectancy across the population, and preventable morbidity outcomes, such as childhood and adult diseases and hospital admissions, among others. And finally, 3. The monetized health benefit in terms of avoided cost of illness or resource costs, gains in economic productivity or opportunity costs, and societal welfare gains due to quality of life improvement. ClimateGauge also carries out an uncertainty analysis using a Monte Carlo simulation. Application of ClimateGauge. As a first example of the use of ClimateGauge, the software was used to assess the health co-benefits of the climate mitigation proposals reviewed under the Lancet Pathfinder Commission. A report has been submitted to the Lancet for publication. This slide shows a source receptor matrix table of the life years gained in a receiver country whose name is indicated at the start of each row for a 10 kiloton PM 2.5 emission reduction in an emitter country indicated at the top of each column. The analysis covers the 53 member states across the WHO Euro region. In passing, as a rule of thumb, roughly 12.5 gained life years is equivalent to 1 postponed premature death. The yellow cells indicate the benefit to the population in the country in which the emissions are cut, while the remaining data along a column show the distributed benefit across other countries. In the case of Belgium, the spillover effect amounts to nearly 50% of the total benefit, with France, Germany, and the Netherlands standing to benefit the most. In the case of Italy, 93% of the total benefit impacts Italians. The graph on the right shows the within and outside country benefit split for NOx emission reductions. This slide shows the analysis of the health gains and economic benefits of Colombia's NDC submission to the UNFCCC. These results were published in a WHO report and were presented at COP26 Glasgow in 2021. According to Colombia's NDC ambition, emissions of CO2 and black carbon in 2030 would be reduced by 58% and 22% respectively through implementation of 148 interventions in the area of energy, industry, transportation, waste and agricultural management, as well as financial measures. Significant reductions of air pollutants, PM, NOx, SOx, and ammonia would also be achieved. See graph at bottom left. The postponed premature deaths and economic benefit, including averted morbidity, are presented in the graphs at the top of the slide. Results are shown as box and whisker plots using different health risk assessment models, including the GBD risk functions. The bar chart at the bottom right indicates the mortality benefit trend between 2021 and 2030. An expected 25,000 premature deaths would be averted for an equivalent economic benefit of over $13 billion. In 2030, the benefit represents 0.64% of GDP. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention. For any questions or clarifications, you can reach me at the email indicated. Kapun.
Very many thanks to Dr. Joseph Spadaro. And again, a very interesting tool for us to then consider. We'll share the link after this meeting as well for all of us to explore a bit further. And hopefully it can feed into our panel discussion, which will be the next part of our session today. We'll just call on all our speakers onto the stage once it's set up. In the meantime, I'd just like to encourage everyone to please you can still ask or add your questions on Menti. If you can still, you can use the QR code that's here or go to menti.com and plug in the number that's there. So please do share your thoughts or any questions on this website. In the meantime, I'll now invite first our chair, Professor YY, to come to the stage, as well as Professor Gabriel, Dr. Alex, as well as Modi to the stage, please. Please give a warm welcome back to the stage.
Right. Hello again, everyone. Please take a seat. So for this session to be truly effective, I strongly encourage all of you to participate. And you could raise your hands and we could get the mics to you. Or if you fancy a bit of physical activity, you could actually walk to the mics and ask your question. But perhaps just to kick things off, I have some questions for our very distinguished panelists. And maybe I could start off with Gabriel first. And what I'll do is I'll ask each of you a very short question, and then you could think about it while I move on to the next. So for Gabriel, I think Alex earlier on talked about the difference between slow-burning crises, which are much more chronic in nature, such as climate change, antimicrobial resistance, increasing prevalence of NCDs, versus what you have talked about, which is a very rapidly emerging pandemic that requires immediate action by governments. The difference between these two types of crisis is actually quite important, because I would like to hear what are your thoughts in terms of getting governments, getting people to act? And how would the communications be made such that it is effective regardless of whether it is a rapidly emerging health crisis, which people tend to pay attention to, versus something that is slow burning in the background, that climate change, we've been talking about it for the past few decades, and really, if we look at what Modi have presented, we are nowhere near some of the targets that we aim to achieve. So that's the first question to you. How do we really spur action and influence communications for crisis, regardless of whether they're slow burning or rapidly emerging?
Thanks, YY. I think it's really the age-old question, isn't it? I mean, COVID is perhaps the exception rather than the rule. Of infectious agents, if you actually look at the work of, say, Chris Merry's shop, IHME, and look at the burden of disease. Infectious conditions generally don't carry nearly as many potential years of life lost or DALYs as non-communicable conditions. Whether you're talking about the cardiometabolic conditions that Alex talked about, or whether you're talking about climate change effects on health that Modi talked about, or indeed when you think about the huge burden of mental conditions, mental health conditions. But COVID was the exception, wasn't it? COVID actually bent the longevity curve of every country that I know of, every single one. So it actually has carried and continues to carry enormous burden of disease or burden of illness. And it's that immediacy that has spurred governments into action, and of course, governments generally bringing the population and its people with them. If you want to tackle diabetes and the obesity crisis, it would be a very different set of techniques that you would be bringing to the table. The People's Health Movement in this country has done a very good job, really, in engaging the public, in involving the public, and in making the public own the issue. And I think that civil society has a large part to play. Obviously, the state of civil society in different countries vary, the definition of civil society vary, and the functions of the non-governmental sector varies between countries. And one really has to just look at the context and then find a way that would motivate and engage people. And without actually passing the buck and say, now, I'm empowering you, but I'm not providing any support. I mean, it's a very large difference. So I have no magic pill or magic solution, but I think that one has to recognize that nudging people and nudging governments and getting both to work together are not easy. But I suspect that new media, whether that's social media or chatbots or AI, I suspect that that will have a much bigger role to play. And public health or global health types have always been seen as Luddites, from the Industrial Revolution to now the fourth Industrial Revolution. So I think that we really must ask ourselves as public health types, are we again the Luddites of this new world? And therefore, we must do better ourselves before we ask that of the people.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And I think I'd like to point about the ownership by individuals and the civil societies on some of these issues. And actually, when I talk about ownership, this is where I want to come to Modi, because the ownership of scientific knowledge that is generated, it's one important aspect, because the Wellcome Trust is a very influential generator of top frontier scientific knowledge. And I've always been questioning, not just to Wellcome, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the National Research Foundation of many countries, how does a grant agency as influential as the Wellcome actually track the use of this scientific knowledge that is generated? And more importantly, does Wellcome actually incentivize the awardees to go beyond just making scientific discovery, to really make that leap to translation and to what we talk about, making use of that knowledge to spur action, not necessarily by the government, but spur action at the individual level as well. So Modi, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. That's a great question. And actually, I think was perhaps the question that really drove the adoption of a new strategy by Wellcome. Because for the last 5 or so decades, we have been investing in frontier science, like you say, but not necessarily, we have had some breakthroughs in terms of scientific advancements, but haven't necessarily seen changes in the world that commensurate with the investments we've made. And so at the heart of our new strategy is really about funding science that leads to impact and action. And that was why I gave the example of the carbon brief. And the way we are aiming to facilitate that under our new model, particularly in climate change, is really looking at transdisciplinary research, in which research priorities are generated together with by the scientists, but working together with the research users, the policymakers, finding out what kind of science and evidence do you need to help advance this particular agenda. So, economic modelling, for instance, understanding the costs and cost effectiveness of different policy options are one tool that we hear policymakers would like to use. And so we want to ensure that scientists answering science questions that are going to help drive change in the real world. We're very much funding in the climate change area science at the translational end. So the way we're setting up funding calls is requiring scientists to partner with, it might be policymakers, it might be the advocates who are speaking to policymakers, it might be the members of the public or community themselves who are affected by the problems and forming those research questions. And that lies very much at the heart of how we're aiming to change things in the future. We'll wait and see if it works, but certainly from my experience in working in policy, I worked in non-communicable diseases and obesity in the UK at that kind of science evidence policy interface, and that's where you get change, where you've got the scientists working very close with the policy system.
Thank you, Modi. And this is perhaps where I would review that actually I was one of the beneficiaries of Wellcome, because I was funded by Wellcome for 4 years of my life. And this is where I will do a little plug, not because it's Wellcome, but I think the Wellcome Trust has actually done fantastically well at requiring all their scientific papers to be made open source. And this was as early as perhaps 15 years ago. They were already providing additional research funding to scientists to make their publications open source, as well as the data that they collect to be open source. And I think Wellcome has this tradition of recruiting scientific communicators as well, to make the science that they have discovered understandable by the lay people. And I thought that is something that I'll highlight. So, but when we talk about science, and this is actually a question that I received from the audience, so strongly encourage the audience to continue posting questions or to approach the mic. And I do see one, and I see two. I will come to both of you, but I just have one question for Alex first, which is what someone have posted, and it's around differing views from modelers. So far, we've heard that we have a fantastic example of how the right use of data from China have actually provided very useful insights to the whole world. But that is because the data was in the hands of a top epidemiologist like Professor Leong. Alex, if the data is being manipulated by a rogue modeler that comes out with sensational news, that news media, the media of the world loves bad news, how would the lay public or governments be able to differentiate between what is a useful and ethical piece of information that has been generated by models versus a rogue modeler who just wants to push a particular agenda? And earlier on, you talk about vaping. I could equally find a modeler that would come out and say that actually, based on my modeling, vaping helps to save lives. What are your thoughts to that?
Okay, it's a good example, because actually the very first touch point that I had with the vaping example was a rogue modeling group funded by the tobacco industry who purported to show through their model that actually the vaping would be beneficial. The problem was that the way they had structured it, there was some technical details about how the model had been built that would automatically bias it in favor of any policy which was looking at cessation rather than uptake of new vaping. So I think that those rogue modelers are probably much rarer than you would think based on this question. But I think that more of a problem is not so much rogues, but just inept modelers. It's very easy to build a mathematical model of COVID. We've seen that during the course of the pandemic, that because data becomes so available, that people can scrape them off the web, they can make a nice, shiny interface on the web and have predictions and so on, but without really understanding the fundamental epidemiology underlying that. And for those of us who work in the field, it's quite easy to identify the flaws in those models. But for the general public and maybe for the policymakers, they may struggle to do that. And unfortunately, I don't really have a solution. I think that the best is that you develop those kind of trusted relationships between those making the decisions and the people that they have worked with in the past and to some degree can trust. And there can become the experts that they consult to see whether this is a bona fide model or if it's just put together with someone with a bachelor's in mathematics.
Thanks, Alex, because we did actually come across some of the predictions that were made by rogue modelers that predicted that COVID-19 would end on a specific date. in December 2020. And of course, that didn't come true, so we know that was not true. But at that point in time when it was made in July of 2020, you can be sure that news media around the world would love to sensationalize it. And I think this is also where, when Alex talks about how road modelers are not as frequent or as common as we think, but I suspect the petrochemical industry have precisely been using models to try and look at what is the impact that fossil fuels will have on the environment, and making certain statements and claims that subsequently were picked up. And I think that has influenced the degree of climate action in the world. Jocelyn, I know you have a question. Perhaps first to you. We will take both questions, so then we can let the panelists have a time to think through. So Jocelyn first, and then the lady behind.
Thank you, YY. This has been a great session. I love the energy and the format, but also super informative, taking a bit of a journey down memory lane at the same time that you're setting us up for the future. And this has been really helpful for me as a journal editor. I'm Jocelyn Clark. I'm the international editor at the BMJ, and most recently the executive editor of The Lancet. So I'm very happy to be here, and I wanted to make a couple of comments and then put a question to the panel. In particular, this builds off Dr. Modi's presentation, and I also want to share my applause to welcome for the leadership in the field of climate and health in particular. Without you, there wouldn't be a climate and health agenda for sure. And I like your laying out of a new strategic direction for the future, which is very much what I'm thinking about as a journal editor. And I think the questions around equity, diversity, and inclusion are at the core, and we ignore them at our peril. If we don't have more active engagement and effort around transforming the status quo, we'll continue to get pulled back to what we're seeing currently. And when you put up that slide to show the top 10 publications in climate and health, I was, of course, very intrigued as a journal editor. And it certainly confirms my suspicion that we have tended to be more about describing the problem rather than focusing on solutions. So I think my focus now as a journal editor, and this is the question I'm going to come to for the panel about what the journal should be doing in terms of prioritizing and amplifying the cutting edge and the future directions rather than just looking at impacts, is a bit concerning, because I think we're at that stage where we need to be looking more at solutions. And I would suggest to you, Dr. Modi, that when you formulate your funding calls and require very admirable things like having the civil society or patient advocates, et cetera, involved, that you also consider the importance of in-country leadership. Because in just the same way that all of us have been describing leading research and publications emanating mostly from male-led research groups in elite institutions, we need to equally be surfacing and amplifying the exceptional and abundant leadership and scientific expertise of our colleagues in country, particularly in low and middle income countries. And this is just vastly missing from the literature, particularly in COVID, where the concentration of power and privilege associated with scientific publications have been concentrated in a very narrow group. So my question to you is, how do we overcome these problems? Did you know that in the Lancet Countdown project, just 6 of 44 indicators have sex disaggregated data? So the Countdown group, which is the only independent accountability mechanism in the entire world on this topic, is not able to generate evidence that can support policy and action in an area where we know that the impacts of climate, the burdens of climate, are gendered. So how do we come up with policy if we don't even have the most basic sex disaggregated data? Marina Romanella, who's the executive director of the Lancet Countdown, recently in a webinar that I chaired, reported this deficiency and committed countdown to trying to overcome that change. But clearly, the ability to do so lies in the hands of some researchers. So can I ask the panel if they might comment on the equity, diversity, and inclusion issue with regard to your work at the leading edge of informing crisis management, particularly from a scientific point of view, and the role of journals to support such progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Could we also take the second question as well?
Hi, thank you so much for organizing such a thought-provoking session, and I'm really I learned a lot of things from you, and it's really I think this is really insightful. And my name is Ryan Guy. I come from National Institute of Population and Social Security Research of Japan, and it's a research institute that's a part of Ministry of Health, and I've been involved in a lot of opportunities to just use a lot of modelings to project population dynamics and the health outcome. So probably my questions is really a general technical one, but I just recognize it's not limited to a technical part of it. So as a modeling or as a modeler, we always, sort of encounter some uncertainties, which is probably related of the limitation of data, also related to the technical aspect, and also, sort of thing to predict something happen in future. So for this uncertainties, and I think this is scientific things, but really need to communicate to the policymaker, community, to the, the public. And you communicate not only limited to the academic field, but also to non-academic field. So I'm really curious and really appreciate if you could share your experience and your idea how to, strategically communicate in a scientific way to, to the policies, and really bring the changes to the society, and really bring the translation of the academic findings and evidence into the policy making. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So two very good questions. Perhaps the first question I could pose it to both Gabriel and Moldy. The second question around communicating uncertainties, perhaps to Alex, and then of course I invite Gabriel to add on as well. But Gabriel, to you first. This bit about you are a leader in leading crisis management responses. How it's evidence, what do you do when the evidence itself to support policy decisions may not necessarily encompass the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusivity?
I mean, I think that Jocelyn brought up a pain point, particularly in this region, to be honest. This region has not been at the sort of vanguard of EDI. And I think that part of that is tradition, whatever tradition may mean to you. Part of that is simply it hasn't been on the agenda and perhaps has been kept off the agenda. And I think that Jocelyn is absolutely right. I think funders like the Wellcome and my present employer, the Hong Kong Jockey Club Charities Trust, I think that we have not just a moral responsibility, but I think that we have really a fiduciary responsibility, because whether it's the Wellcome or the Jockey Club Charities Trust, we all are regulated by our own governments. And we must also follow best practice. And if you just simply look at listing requirements of public companies in most of the major stock exchanges in the world, Hong Kong, London, New York, Singapore, and you would find that ESG, the G bit, is actually not nearly as strictly adhered to than the E bit, even though the E bit is kind of still de minimis, but it's much better and it's much more quantified than the G bit. And I think that, funders have a major role to play. And in fact, some of you will have read, my other hat is, of course, serving on the board of the Wellcome. Wellcome got into a lot of trouble recently about the G-bit, i.e. All about anti-racism. In fact, next week, the entire board is going through retraining in anti-racism. And so I think EDI, in all its manifestations, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's not having manuals at conferences, I think that we have a tremendous role to play. And as YY pointed out, Wellcome was one of the first to insist on open publishing. And so I think that there is a lot that funders can do. I still remember in the UK, a very good example is a very, very dear friend who was the chief medical officer for England, Sally Davis. She essentially imposed the Athena Swan criteria for all NIHR grants, National Institute of Health Research grants. So she was the NHS R&D chief before she became CMO. She took that budget and put it and established the NIHR, which is now very, very large. But as part of the process, she basically shreds every single application unless it meets the gender diversity criteria. And that almost overnight changed the UK academic landscape in terms of research teams and research leadership to this very day, because I still serve on the NIHR vetting panels, and it's really been night and day. And so I think that, that is a very, very powerful tool that we must use and deploy much more liberally, particularly in places that may not have been as advanced as other places, while being very sensitive and very appropriate about bringing people along rather than imposing from the top down.
Thanks, Gabriel. And Moldy, what are your thoughts, especially in terms of what Wellcome has done, given that what Gabriel has already alluded to in terms of Wellcome's record?
Yeah, and thank you, esteemed panel colleagues, for highlighting some of the other things that Wellcome have been doing in this space. So I can give some examples of how we're trialing things in climate. So we've had 3 calls that we've launched in the last year. One of them that I've been leading on has been specifically focused on funding research in low and middle income countries. So identifying this particular call invited researchers to identify effective interventions for people to adapt to heat in developing countries. And we required that the PI for the research applications needed to be from and based at an institution in the country where the research was proposing to be taken. I think that was kind of a first for Wellcome, that the way we've kind of piloted the running of this call. We also set up a college of reviewers, which was primarily based on researchers from those regions. So the research is being reviewed and judged by peers who are familiar with the contexts. And then the committee, likewise, we tried to ensure that it had expert researchers from those regions. I will say it wasn't that easy putting that together, because the pool of researchers to draw from was much smaller. And so often leading researchers who wanted to either advise you on a committee or be a peer reviewer were then also applying to the call. So, taking that sort of approach comes with challenges. We're hoping to announce the awardees in the next 2 months or so. And actually, I think it's quite exciting. So we're kind of evaluating and learning from that particular approach to see, compare it to another call that's coming out, which is going to be a global call, inviting applications to study impacts of climate change anywhere in the world. And actually, we will see to what degree is there diversity in the top research proposals that are funded from an open call that's open globally compared to one that's targeted at researchers from a particular region. Our peers who have been funding in LMICs for longer than we have, low and middle income countries, have told us that sometimes you might have to make adjustments in terms of the quality of the research that you might fund might not be at the same level to begin with. And we were certainly impressed by the quality of research applications that came through, but we also recognise that capacity strengthening needs to be built in within research proposals, and that was another criteria we required, that every proposal included a description, a capacity strengthening plan, and there was points allocated for the inclusion and attention to that plan, and they needed it to be tailored to that particular region. So it might have been training PhDs, enabling policymakers to better understand the research, training the researchers in communication skills and policy engagement, for instance. And we also paid attention to gender. There wasn't a specific criteria on gender per se, but that was also a lens within which we were looking. So we're going to be kind of learning from that process. I think in terms of what journals can do, one of the commissions we've been funding, which we were really challenging them and pushing them on increasing the diversity of the commissioners involved. This is a second commission that we're funding this particular group to do. And we wanted and they came back to us and said, it was a Lancet commission, they were like, it's been really hard to be able to increase that diversity because some of the experts we've identified in regions across the world don't meet the strict criteria of the Lancet in terms of their publications record for them to be able to be included as commissioners, even though they have other forms of expertise. So I think there's a question we need to ask ourselves as a global scientific committee: what is knowledge, and what types of knowledge are most important? Thank you. Well, let's talk about it, because that was what they said, and I don't know if it was a get out clause to go with the ones they'd wanted. I don't know, but let's talk about it, because that was what I heard, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. Chris.
Another issue you're not talking about is that everybody's volunteering their time, and to ask people in low and middle income countries to volunteer time is wrong, and there has to be a way to get around that.
Thank you. Yes, and that's the other thing. So we also did pay. Wellcome, as a general rule, doesn't pay peer reviewers, but we recognise that actually time is really important. And so everyone who's been volunteering to help us achieve our objectives in this particular call that's focused on low and middle income countries has been remunerated for that time. There are questions about the level of remuneration we're still learning, and we'll evaluate to see whether that's an approach to take, because, as a general rule, we don't, but we are certainly making a strong case that actually people's time is important. Not everyone comes from a place of privilege where, they can do some of this work for free because they're not paid to do that as part of their day jobs. So we definitely are open to hearing ideas. How can we improve? Tell us. We're open to feedback, but we can only change if we hear, what we're doing well and what we're not.
Thank you, Modi. And I'm very glad that you brought up the point on capacity building, because while we have two of the top leading world funders on stage, Wellcome and Jockey Club, just mentioned that we are talking about modeling, and modelers is a scarce commodity, a scarce human resource commodity in many parts of the world. So strongly encourage you to think about funding the capacity building of modelers. But final question back to Alex, to you.
Okay,
Which is around
The
really
uncertainty. Yeah.
how do we communicate uncertainties? Because as we know, the media, the policymakers, they love absolutism. They love sensational stories with zero uncertainty. What is your experience, and what are your thoughts in terms of communicating, understanding, getting the data to really try to get people to understand that modeling provides an interval of estimates?
So I don't have a good answer to this, unfortunately. Technically, it is de rigueur that we will construct confidence intervals for our projections, and we'll look at the dependence of the output onto the assumptions that go into it as some sort of sensitivity analysis. So when we publish our papers, we're always doing that. My experience has been probably a bit similar to yours, that when you then try to communicate to policymakers, they don't like the uncertainty part. They like if they just got one single line which says how many cases will be each day, but they don't like the confidence interval which extends from as close to zero up to a larger number. Rather, what I've been finding is that what they like, and it seems to gel with their mindset, is to have scenarios. So in other words, you say this is a kind of a good scenario, bad scenario, okay scenario, and to present those, but rather than showing confidence intervals or the actual parametric uncertainty that goes into the projections.
So I think it takes a leader with a great degree of humility to actually stand in front of a camera to say that some of the estimates that they are getting comes with a degree of uncertainty. And what it's certain is that I know that we're running out of time, and my co-hosts are signaling that it's time to move on to the next segment. So with that, may I invite all of you to give my fellow panelists a round of applause for their very good answers. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a rich discussion by our panelists, Professor YY, Dr. Bodhi, Professor Gabriel, and Dr. Alex Cook. So now we are coming to nearly an end of our talk, which we will go over the time for about 5 minutes. So please stay with us until the end. And ladies and gentlemen, so now please welcome Mr. Sarin Casey, our colleague from HITAP.
Hello. Okay. Hello. Mic check. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for coming and joining our session and fantastic presentation, PMAC talks, I should say, and great discussion and some of the questions that came out really useful. So I'm here, I'm Sarin from HITAP on behalf of our team, not only at HITAP, but also others who are part of this Lancet Commission. And the objective of the commission is to improve the usefulness of modeling. And before we tell you what we are planning to do, maybe we play around with you. Is people in the audience familiar with this graph? Raise your hand. More hands. We saw similar graphs, many of those from Prof. Gabriel's. Anyone? So this graph is trying to depict what we saw many a times during COVID-19, right? Ring a bell? Hands? Okay. And if I ask you a question, so there's two parts to this graph. So there's the tall curve, and then there's the smoother, smaller curve. Which curve, if I ask you, where would you rather be, where would you say? The left-hand side or the right-hand side? And you can scream. Right. Why would you say right-hand side? You have a speaker right there.
It's much more pleasant.
Okay, that's one answer. Anyone else? Dr. Yot, do you want to tell us why would you prefer the right-hand side? Safe. Anyone? Yeah? Less stressful. Yes. If I were given the choice, I would choose the same. This one, as we saw during COVID-19, higher mortality rate in a short span of time, higher infection rate in a short space of time, really puts a lot of strain on health system resources, but also decision makers. People's lives are lost, and it creates a cascade of impact. And if we manage to stretch that impact over a longer period of time, using lesser resources, that can only benefit our society, right? So I think we are in agreement that we prefer to be on the right side. So then the question, why modeling, right? Why are we obsessed or focused with modeling? And the main reason is that modeling actually allows us to transition from this bigger curve to the smaller curve. Not in itself, but through providing information by showing consequence of action or inaction, as YY mentioned earlier. And we saw this during COVID-19. We started off with this graph many a times, and then we slowly transitioned, and we heard the term flatten the curve so many times, right? So this is why we want to emphasize on modeling, because it allows us to get to a better place. It's a safer place, and it's a nicer place to be in, right? And as we heard from the talk earlier, it's not just epidemiological modeling, but modeling in general. It's a tool of the modern era, just like stone used to be a tool back in those stone ages, right? We found a way to utilize it and make it useful for the society. Similarly, models are also tools, just like those stones, And it's only wise that we make an effort to make it better for the better of society. Anyone here know the story of blind man and the elephant? Raise your hand. Okay, quite a few of you. So it's actually not a story, it's actually a poem written by John Sachs in the 1800s. And the story is about these blind men holding different parts of the elephant and thinking that it's not the elephant at all. So some would hold the tail and think it's a rope. Some would hold the tusk and think it's a spear. Some would hold the foot and think it's a tree, right? So what am I trying to get at? If we only focus on some parts and not the whole, we can be misled, just like these blind men who don't think it's an elephant, but think it's either a door, a tree, or whatever. And the modeling is the same. If you think about crisis, all the crises that our speakers demonstrated, from climate, health, or any other crisis, right? Crises tend to affect different aspects of our lives. First on health, if you think about health, then economy, right? It can be on environment, biodiversity. At the simplest and at the core, like personal level, even well-being, right? And then you can think about education, et cetera, et cetera. So crisis, it may start off with one field or one aspect of impact, but then it tends to transcend into different parts. So if we isolate all these impacts and areas, we tend to get a smaller picture, only a partial picture. Now, try to think modelers, and modeling exercise as this elephant, and the rest of society or us as these blind men, right? If we only focus on public health, impact on public health, if we ignore the economic side, if we ignore all the other aspects, we are not able to get a comprehensible picture, and we are not able to find a better solution, right? So we need to work together. Two ways to think about it. One is on health, economy, so different multidisciplinary approach. The second one is modelers also need to talk to each other. We can replace these blind men by modelers, right? If they don't talk to each other, we're not making smart use of the models, right? So that's another. Now, our approach to, so this is what we don't want to do. We don't want to work alone. We don't want to focus only on health. So what do we want to do? We want to create a framework that allows us to integrate not only the modeling, the technical sides of modeling, but also the environment around it, right? And that starts by looking at the governance, the decision-making process, the structures and the stakeholders involved, who gets to be in that decision-making space, and how do they make the decisions. The actual model development and implementation, what are the standards? We talked about rogue modelers, right? Are there any standards, and how can we make them accountable to those standards? And if there are standards, can we push those boundaries? Can we make modeling even better, right? Communication, we talk about, you highlighted the role of communication to policymakers, but also between modelers. So this is another area. And we talked about journals. What is the role of journals? What is the role of funder? They can all come together and create a way where model results can be communicated and digested by a different audience. And evaluation, why I also talk about M&E, that models can serve like a M&E tool, but going even beyond just thinking as an M&E tool, we need to create an environment where M&E can take place, and for that we need resources, right? So these are some of the core elements that we think are important to look at, and some of the enabling environments that allow modeling to thrive. Our approach does not stop there. Yes, we are focused on epi-modeling, but we want to take lessons from different areas. There are modelers and epidemiologists like Prof. Gabriel who are able to go on the ground, take lessons, and then translate it into modeling so that policies can be enacted. But there are others who just punch numbers in their back office and are sort of distinct or distant from the reality in the field. So we want to be able to connect those who work on the ground, those who actually see what's happening on the ground, so that the modelers are able to make realistic assumptions as well as counterfactual scenarios, so that policymakers have an idea, a realistic idea of what to choose and what not to choose. We talk about the value of intervention, the value of action, the value of inaction, communication, behavior science, the role of funders, right? So these are all the things that we want to bring in together in the Lancet Commission, so that it's not only just about modeling, but the environment and all the aspects surrounding modeling that contribute to impact from crisis. Now, the commission itself, we have two co-chairs leading the commission, Mark Chit from LSHTM and Dr. Wanudiri from HITAP, who's a health economist. And we talked about diversity, and we do take that very seriously. So we have 25 multidisciplinary commissioners, geographically and also gender balanced, and then who come together to finalize the scope of the commission. The framework that we showed earlier is just a start to get the commissioners start thinking and brainstorming together. And the framework is may end up looking completely different to what we presented here. So that's the second part. And then actually conducting the research that is necessary, finding consensus on key recommendation, not only from modelers, but policymakers, other research fields, funders, et cetera, media. And then to work on disseminating and actually practicing some of the recommendations that come out of the Lancet. So yeah, this is what we are planning to do with modeling. And thank you for sharing all your experiences today. We will definitely take them on board. And we hope that you can follow us through our journey. It's going to be a 2-year ride. And if you are interested in this commission, or if you have comments and suggestions for our team, please reach out to us directly. So yeah, thank you. That's what I wanted to share about the Lancet Commission. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sareen, and for sharing this important work. And we are really glad to have all of you here as part of this journey. This is, I think, the first time we are really sharing this with a broad group. So please do share your thoughts and feedback. We also would like to hear from you about your feedback on the event overall. We very much would like to use it as we go forward to improve it. As we now come to a close, we'd just like to take an opportunity to thank all our speakers, Professor Wai, Professor Gabriel, Dr. Alex, Dr. Modi, as well as Sareen, for giving us a rich set of food for thought as we go forward into PMAC 2023 as well. And with that, I'd like to conclude the session. We'd like to have a group photo with all of you here as well. So I'd like to invite first our panelists on the stage. And if all of you are willing to please join us here for a quick photograph with thanks to our communications team. Please. Thank you.